Hey, old man, you have two problems. Problem one, you're driving a piece of scrap metal. Problem two, you're driving it on my property. The voice boomed from the patrol car's speaker, crackly and patronizing, cutting through the steady growl of the 1978 Chevrolet C10. Arthur Bishop glanced at the rearview mirror, where the red and blue lights blinked angrily in the bright North Carolina afternoon sun. They looked out of place and out of place in the peaceful landscape of lush, green tobacco fields stretching to the horizon, a lush, quiet green. He sighed, a sigh not of fear, but of long weariness, a weariness not of the long journey, but of the burden of the state he was passing through. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the roughness of the skin, weathered by the sun and wind of the election campaign, and the wrinkles of a man who had shouldered too much responsibility. He slowly pulled the old pickup, its silver-blue color faded with age, onto the gravel road. The red dust of the coastal land rose in a small cloud behind the wheels, a reluctant greeting. This was a personal trip, a farewell trip, a pilgrimage to the past. But it seemed that, even in his most private moments, the outside world always found a way to intrude, to remind him that some roads were never truly smooth. Why was a man in a work jacket and driving his father's car being treated like a criminal? Where was he going that he chose this remote road, a road most politicians would avoid? And more importantly, did the patrolman know that he had just pulled over the car of the most powerful man in the state? Arthur turned off the engine. The familiar hum of the V8, the sound of his childhood, died away. It returned to the thick silence of the countryside. The only sound left was the gentle wind blowing across the fields, creating green ripples. He sat, his hands on the broad, cracked Bakelite steering wheel, waiting. 20 years of discipline in the Marine Corps, from private to officer, had taught him that in confrontations, the first to lose his cool is the loser. The patrol car door creaked open. A large man stepped out, his bulk making the gray highway patrol uniform seem pitifully tight. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, but Arthur could see that his face was red from the sun and probably from high blood pressure. A neatly trimmed mustache did little to conceal the haughty expression on his lips. He walked slowly, smugly, like a lord patrolling his turf. Another officer, younger and thinner, stepped out of the passenger seat, but he kept his distance, looking nervous and uncertain, like an extra who didn't know his lines. The big patrolman, Dean Harding, approached the driver's window. He didn't crouch, he stood straight, hands on hips, forcing Arthur to look up. A little psychological trick to assert power. One Arthur had seen hundreds of times in political boardrooms. "Car papers and driver's license," Harding ordered, his voice unceremonious, as if he were talking to a vending machine. Arthur, moving slowly and deliberately, reached into the glove compartment, which smelled of his father's old cigarettes and motor oil. He pulled out an old leather wallet and a set of documents wrapped in a clear plastic bag. The car was registered to him, Arthur Bishop, but the address was the family cabin in Pasquotank County, where he had been born and raised, where he had learned to drive in this car. It was not the official address at the governor's mansion in Raleigh. It was a deliberate choice, a way to keep a part of his life private, a refuge from the pomp and circumstance of politics. His driver's license had the same address, a normal name, a normal address. Harding snatched the papers from him roughly. He squinted in the bright sunlight. "Arthur Bishop, what are you doing here from Pasquotank? Lost? Looking for work?" "I'm on my way to Ocracoke," Arthur replied, his voice low and even, betraying no emotion. "To attend a memorial service." "A memorial service?" Harding snickered. A short, unpleasant laugh. "Dressed like this to a service?" He glanced at Arthur's frayed Carhartt jacket and faded work jeans. "You look more like a runaway construction worker than a mourner." Arthur did not answer. He only looked straight into Harding's eyes, a calm, unflinching gaze, a gaze that had faced hateful eyes in war and cunning eyes in politics. Harding seemed to feel uncomfortable with that silence. The calmness of the other man challenged him. He returned the papers, not handing them to him, but tossing them into Arthur's lap. "Your windshield is cracked, a long crack. That's a safety violation." Harding pointed to a small, star-shaped crack in the bottom corner of the passenger side of the windshield, a crack that had been there since his father was alive, a memory of a pebble thrown into the car on a fishing trip. It was so small, it was almost impossible to see without looking for it. "I understand," said Arthur. "I will have it fixed when I get a chance." "You'll fix it, but you'll still get a ticket today," Harding said, sounding amused. "That's a big ticket. It'll cost you a day's pay. Unless there's some special reason why I shouldn't." It was a suggestion, a lure, a door ajar. Arthur remained silent. He knew the game. He had heard it from constituents complaining at town halls, stories of police officers abusing their power on deserted streets, picking on vulnerable people, old cars, migrant workers. He had led an internal investigation, but it had always stalled for lack of evidence. Victims were too afraid to testify. Harding's gaze swept across the cabin, past the cracks in the dashboard, and stopped at Arthur's wrist. It was a 1960s Omega Seamaster DeVille, its silver dial a warm cream, its leather strap worn and supple. It was the watch his father had received when he retired from 30 years of hard work at the Newport News shipyard. It was priceless to Arthur, not for its material value, but because it was his last link to the man who had taught him about integrity and hard work. "Oh," Harding said, his voice drawling, like a fox who's just spotted a juicy chicken. "That's a nice watch." He leaned closer, pretending to examine it, the smell of cheap cigarettes and sour sweat wafting off of him into Arthur's face. "A bum like you in a junk car has a nice watch like that? It must be stolen." "It was my father's," Arthur said, his voice for the first time taking on a cold edge, a warning that Harding was too stupid to recognize. "Your dad? Your dad must be a big shot," Harding sneered. He straightened, the doubt on his face now turning to certainty. "Look, I don't believe you. Something's not right here. Get out of the car. I'm going to search this vehicle." Arthur took a deep breath, feeling the afternoon heat burn his chest. "Patrolman, with all due respect, you have no legal reason to search my car. The Fourth Amendment still applies in North Carolina. A small crack in the glass is not reason to suspect criminal activity." This legal resistance was exactly what Harding had been waiting for. It gave him an excuse to escalate, to assert his power. "You dare to lecture me on the law, son? You are obstructing a law enforcement officer. That is a felony. Get out of the car, or I will drag you out and handcuff you for resisting." To avoid a pointless and potentially dangerous physical confrontation, Arthur slowly opened the car door and stepped out. He was almost as tall as Harding, but his build was leaner, more muscular, the result of a life of discipline. Heat rushed into his face, like a wall of fire. "Hands on the roof," Harding ordered, his voice full of triumph. Arthur obeyed, placing his calloused hands on the hot roof of the truck. Harding began to search him roughly, patting his pockets, his sides, as if examining an animal. The young patrolman, Mike Evans, stood behind him, pale. He knew this was wrong. He knew Harding was a bully, a racist, a petty corrupter. He had seen Harding do this dozens of times, usually to Hispanic workers or young black men. Each time, a small part of his idealistic self died, but he was just a rookie, and Harding was his training officer, a man with the power to decide his career in a small town where everyone knew each other. So he stayed silent, ashamed and helpless, finding nothing on Arthur. Harding turned to the car. He opened the door, rummaged through the cabin, tossed a few old maps and a spare shirt onto the seat. Then he went to the back, where the trunk was covered with an old tarp. He lifted the tarp. There, securely tied with rubber bands, was a gray metal box, the kind used for military equipment, locked with a sturdy abloy padlock. "What's in here?" Harding asked, his eyes lighting up as if he had found treasure. He had found his box of doubt, his reason for continuing the charade. Drugs, illegal guns, illegal money? Inside the box was the American flag, folded with military honors, the same flag that had draped the casket of Arthur's best friend's father, Marine Sergeant David Gunny Miller, who had fought alongside him at Khe Sanh, who had saved his life twice, and who had recently died after a long battle with cancer caused by Agent Orange. Beside it were his medals, including the Purple Heart and the Silver Star. Arthur was carrying them to the memorial service in Ocracoke, a final honor the Miller family had entrusted to him. He would not let someone like Harding tarnish them. "I won't open it without a warrant," Arthur said firmly, his voice lacking any hesitation. This was when Harding decided to play his final card. He moved closer to Arthur, lowering his voice so that only the two of them could hear. The young patrolman, Evans, stood far enough away to not hear clearly, but close enough to see the change in Harding's demeanor, from overt aggression to quiet menace. "Look, Arthur," Harding said, using his name for the first time, as if by way of consolation. "I can be very understanding. I see you're in a hurry. I can forget about the cracked glass. I can forget about this suspicious box. It's all right. You can go now." He paused, glancing down at the watch on Arthur's wrist, his eyes unconcealed with greed. "But that watch, it doesn't look right to you. It looks lonely. A beautiful thing like this needs someone who can appreciate it. Maybe it wants to stay here with me in North Carolina, where it belongs. Do you understand what I mean, son?" There was silence. The cicadas seemed to have stopped at the brazenness of the offer. Harding was not merely harassing. He was not merely discriminating. He was blatantly demanding a bribe. He was committing robbery under the color of law. Arthur Bishop looked Harding straight in the eye. For a moment, the soldier's discipline vanished, replaced by the icy fury of a leader betrayed by the people he had sworn to serve and protect. He had spent his entire political career fighting this festering rot, this corruption that festered in the dark corners of government, and now it stood before him, with a mustache, a smirk, and the smell of moral decay. He knew he could end this with a sentence. "I am the governor." But that wouldn't be enough. Harding would only get a reprimand, maybe a few days' suspension. He would be back on the road, back on his trail. No, this tumor had to be removed. And to do that, he needed irrefutable evidence. He needed a witness. He glanced at the young patrolman standing nervously in the distance, trying not to look at the murky exchange. He needed to push the situation a little further. Arthur hesitated, then sighed as if resigned. "It was my father's," he said, his voice sad and regretful. He slowly took off the watch. The old leather strap creaked slightly as it slid from his wrist. The afternoon sun caught the glass, giving it a final gleam. He held out the watch, palm up. "If it will help me continue my journey." Harding couldn't hide his triumphant smile, a smile of satisfied greed. He snatched the watch away, as if afraid Arthur would change his mind. He stuffed it into his pocket quickly, like a petty thief. "See? No trouble. You're a good boy." He patted Arthur on the shoulder in a patronizing, insulting touch. "All right. Go away before I change my mind." He turned around, intending to walk back to his car, whistling a cheerful tune as if he had just completed a productive day's work. Patrolman! Arthur's voice rang out, no longer resigned, but cold and authoritative, a voice that could silence an entire auditorium. Harding paused, a little annoyed at being disturbed after he had finished his work. "What now?" "Before I go, I have a small request," said Arthur. "Could you please use your walkie-talkie and call Colonel James Matthews?" Harding turned back, frowning, confusion starting to creep into his smug expression. "Colonel Matthews? What are you doing calling the commander of the highway patrol? Who do you think you are?" Mentioning his name. "I pay his wages," Arthur replied, each word coming out like a hammer blow, clear and decisive. "And he'll want to know why one of his men just committed an armed robbery on his boss on a deserted street." He took a step forward, and his whole demeanor changed. The austerity of the worker was gone, replaced by the unmistakable dignity of a leader, a general. "My name is Arthur Bishop, and I am the governor of this damned state." Silence fell. The hot summer air seemed to freeze. Harding's smile froze, then melted into disbelief, then horror. He stared at Arthur, his eyes wide, searching for a trace of deception, but saw only cold, undeniable truth in those unflinching eyes. The watch in his pocket suddenly felt like a stone, burning his skin. He stuttered, the words unformed. You lied. You can't." But young patrolman Mike Evans had heard enough. He had seen enough. His future, his career, his conscience were all on the line. He no longer feared Harding. He feared the consequences of doing nothing. In a moment of determination born of sheer fear, Evans grabbed the walkie-talkie from his shoulder. His voice was shaky but clear, drowning out the cicadas. "Center, this is Unit 734. We need a supervisor at our location immediately. Level 1 emergency. I repeat, Level 1. There was a pause. Then the dispatcher's voice came through, calm but urgent. 734, confirm situation, any casualties? Evans took a deep breath, glanced from Harding's deathly white face to Governor Bishop's calm eyes. Center, confirm. No casualties, but we're with Governor Bishop. A deadly silence fell over the radio channel. The entire system seemed to stop working for a second. Then, chaos began. Less than 15 minutes later, the deserted road transformed into a theater of state power. 2 patrol cars roared toward them from either side, followed by an unmarked black Chevrolet Suburban. But the most impressive sound didn't come from the ground. It came from the sky. The rotor blades of the Highway Patrol's Bell 407 helicopter grew louder, kicking up dust and dry leaves as it descended, searching for a landing spot in a nearby tobacco field. The black Suburban screeched to a stop. The rear door swung open, and a tall, gray-haired man in a neatly pressed, decorated uniform stepped out. It was Colonel James Jim Matthews, commander of the Highway Patrol, a friend Arthur had known since they were young officers. His already stern face looked like a storm cloud about to burst. He said nothing to Harding or Evans. He walked straight up to Arthur, the walk of a soldier. He stood at attention and saluted, a gesture of deep respect. "Are you all right, Governor?" His voice was filled with concern, but also with suppressed rage. "I'm fine, Jim," Arthur replied, his voice returning to normal. "But your patrol isn't—" The words were like a verdict. Colonel Matthews turned, his eyes like 2 bullets aimed straight at Harding, who stood motionless, his face pale, sweat pouring down his face. "Patrolman Harding," Matthews roared, his voice echoing through the air. "Do you know what you have done? You have not only broken your oath, you have dishonored this badge. You have dishonored the men and women who risk their lives every day to serve the people of this state. You are a disgrace." Harding, now completely broken, began to stammer, making no sense. "Governor, Colonel, it was a mistake. I had a bad day. The heat, I wasn't thinking clearly. Please give me a chance. Arthur cut him off, his voice cold and steely. The heat doesn't turn a good man into a robber. Harding. It just brings out the true nature that's hidden inside you. You're not a misguided officer, you're a criminal in uniform. He turned to Matthews. Jim, I want him dealt with to the fullest extent of the law. No leniency. I want a full investigation of his activities throughout his career. I want to know how many other watches, how much cash has been seized along this road. I want every rock turned over. Harding was disarmed, handcuffed, and escorted to one of the patrol cars by 2 senior officers. He stopped begging, just walked away, a man who had lost everything in a single afternoon because of a small crack in the windshield and a bottomless greed. When the dust settled, when the helicopter had taken off and most of the vehicles had left, only Arthur, Colonel Matthews, and young Patrolman Evans remained. Arthur walked over to Evans, who stood with his head bowed, avoiding his eyes. Raise your head, Patrolman, Arthur said, his voice not harsh. Evans slowly looked up, his eyes red. Governor, I'm sorry. I was so scared. I should have done something sooner. I'm a coward. You were scared, Arthur said, placing a hand on his shoulder. But when the moment came, you did the right thing. You chose the right side. Sometimes courage is not the absence of fear, but acting in spite of fear. You did. Never forget that. He turned to Matthews. Jim, make sure this boy is not bullied. He is our key witness, and perhaps, after this, he will be a better officer. Matthews nodded. Yes, sir, I will personally supervise him. Finally, Arthur returned to his old pickup truck. He opened the metal box, checking that the flag and medals were still intact and undisturbed. Colonel Matthews stepped forward and handed him the Omega watch, which was placed on a clean white handkerchief. Arthur slipped it back onto his wrist. The familiar feel of it was comforting. Thanks, Jim. No, Governor, Matthews said, his voice full of sincerity. We should be the ones thanking you. You helped us remove a tumor we couldn't find on our own. Arthur looked down the deserted road ahead, toward the sea. Jim, it's not that he did this to me. I can take care of myself. It's how many times he did this to voiceless people who couldn't call you, who were so scared they had to give him their father's watch or their last rent money to be left alone. That's the real crime, the betrayal of the public trust. He got in and started the engine. The old V8 roared faithfully. He nodded to Colonel Matthews and continued on his way, leaving behind chaos and a bitter lesson. As he drove into the sunset, on the empty road, he was no longer the governor. He was just Arthur, a son, a friend, a soldier, on a mission to fulfill a promise. And he knew that the real battle was not fought in the halls of the capital, but on streets like this one, in the hearts of men like Harding and Evans. It was a never-ending battle between duty and corruption, between integrity and prejudice. And today, at least on this stretch of road, integrity had won. Now, I want to hear your thoughts on this story. What do you think of Patrolman Evans's decision when he finally radioed in? Was it bravery or just self-preservation? If you were in Governor Bishop's situation, would you let things get so far as to demand a bribe, or would you reveal your identity sooner to resolve the situation? What does this story tell you about the dangers when individual prejudice is combined with state power and personal greed?